Welcome to episode 2 of our 3-part webinar series about the new book, Contain and Eliminate. Before we get started, a few reminders. This is the second of 3 webinars to discuss the new book, Contain and Eliminate, which details the landmark Wilk v. AMA lawsuit in the 1970s and 80s. Part 3 will be a live Q&A with our panelists next Tuesday, January 12th at 2 p.m. Central. The webinars are being recorded and will be posted on ncmic.com following the broadcast. When we began to plan for these webinars, we thought it would be best to hear the story from those with firsthand knowledge of the events surrounding the Wilk v. AMA case. Joining us on the webinars are 3 people with intimate knowledge of the case. First, we have Howard Wolinski, who wrote Contain and Eliminate. We have George McAndrews, who was the attorney who tried the case on behalf of the plaintiff chiropractors, and Dr. Lou Sportelli, a leader in the chiropractic profession. Our conversations with Mr. Wolinski, Mr. McAndrews, and Dr. Sportelli were pre-recorded for today. Part 1 aired last Tuesday. The Q&A webinar next Tuesday will be live, so our listeners will have the opportunity to pose the questions to our panelists. Now let's recap where we left off. For decades, chiropractors had suffered an economic boycott led by the American Medical Association, leading to indignities unimaginable in today's healthcare world. We learned about the AMA's Committee on Quackery. L. Ron Hubbard and his Scientologists infiltrated the IRS, Justice Department, and the AMA itself, and their efforts paved the way to the Wilk v. AMA lawsuit. We identified the hero who would lead the battle for chiropractic, George McAndrews. Let's pick it up with Dr. Sportelli explaining his role leading up to the trial.
I played a key role in fighting the ACA's attorney, Harry Rosenfeld, who was anti the chiropractors filing this lawsuit. He was opposed to it. Needless to say, Harry and I locked horns until the day he died. As far as I was concerned, he was a lawyer that was not willing to do for his client what it should be. Contrast that with the ICA. The ICA's attorney and the ICA board was 100% on board with the Wilk suit. Eventually, we were successful. The ACA essentially supported the Wilk suit. I was involved in fundraising. Obviously, I knew George McAndrews and I knew his brother. And as a result of that relationship and friendship, we were supportive of the litigation all throughout the entire process.
I was a good lawyer. I was a lawyer of the year in my engineering class, and I was second in my law school class. I was editor-in-chief of the Law Review. I told my brother, go to Washington. They're not so pickety about the conflicts. My brother came back a week later and said, George, Dad had kicked the lid off his coffin. You've got 2 degrees from Notre Dame. You've spurred from the practice of law. You're the only member of the family that became a lawyer. And I said, okay, you've done it. You've touched my sore spot. I think you're right. So I took the case.
In 1976, George McAndrews filed the suit Wilk et al. V. AMA et al. On December 9th, 1980, the jury trial began of Wilk v. AMA with Judge Nicholas Bua presiding.
Doyle Taylor moved on around the same time. The AMA basically declared victory and closed the office. The AMA was going broke in 1975. Chiropractors didn't know that. The AMA was very vulnerable at that time, and the AMA took out loans to meet payroll. The AMA got rid of the Office on Quackery and declared victory. Were they victorious? Well, Doyle Taylor claimed to have the proof, and he was number 1 on George McAndrews' witness list. The AMA had hired this fierce lawyer, Max Wildman. He was like the fastest gun in the West in Chicago, as far as lawyers go. His uncle was the U.S. attorney for Indiana. So the AMA hired this guy. I think the idea was to try to scare George. George held his own. He wasn't as famous as Wildman, but, he held his own.
We had evidence that the AMA had sent notices to their state associations related to the state societies or associations to get rid of any documents that involved chiropractic. That was a gift too, because here's what happened. The AMA lost a sack of documents, and they said that it was in a shopping bag, and it had been mistakenly picked up by a collector, and they couldn't get them. Well, we just notified the state societies to demand under subpoena that they produce every single document they ever received from the AMA or its committees involving the subject matter of chiropractic. And they had so many documents, and almost every one of the state societies we went to gave us the AMA documents that had been destroyed, by accident. I didn't believe that, but that's what they said, that it was that the bag that they'd put the documents they'd collected was taken away by the garbage people, apparently. But we got proof. By doing that, we found 14 documents where the AMA just came right out and said, the AMA's hand must not show in all this.
Throughout this trial, there had to be divine intervention.
Max Wellman was probably considered one of the 5 best lawyers in the entire state of Illinois, if not in the country. On a normal workday, he dressed almost in a tuxedo. When he'd go into the court, he had what I would call an impoverished suit that would make him look like he was a poor person without a lot of information. He knew his law, and he built a powerful law firm of general lawyers there in the city. He was totally in charge of the 35 to 40 lawyers that were in the courtroom for the defendants. He was the lead trial lawyer. We had some disagreements with him. I think he made a couple of mistakes that helped me. He came to me before the first trial and he said, George, the subpoenas we're going to be issuing are probably going to go to professional people. I don't think it's appropriate to having a U.S. Marshal or someone go to a professional, an MD or a chiropractor, and frighten them. Why don't you just tell me who it is you want and I'll make certain they appear? I thought, well, that's pretty good. I think he made a mistake because when we were told that the trial would be starting on Monday, I was called by one of my associates. He said, the principal witness, the head of the Committee on Quackery, is leaving for Arizona.
The attorney for the AMA assured George, without the necessity of a legal document, he would produce H. Doyle Taylor, who was the key witness in this whole thing because he was head of the committee. And so, lo and behold, a moving van moves up to H. Doyle Taylor's, and they leave in the middle of the night like the criminal that he was, as far as I'm concerned.
January 31st, 1981. After 36 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict in favor of the AMA. The case was lost. The disappearance of H. Doyle Taylor was a devastating blow, but more damaging were the instructions the judge gave to the jury. He said that the AMA was correct in arguing that the Medical Association had every right under the First Amendment to say what they wanted about chiropractors in their policies and ethics codes. McAndrews had objected as it had nothing to do with the ethical issues of the case, setting it up for an appeal.
Judge Bua said as soon as he'd given the instructions, he knew he'd made a mistake. He called me and told me he hoped we would be appealing. I said, I've already almost completed the appeal brief. If I had lost the first suit, that would have been the end of the conflict. We didn't lose it because we hadn't appealed it.
In 1983, the U.S. Federal Court of Appeals for the 7th District reversed the ruling in Wilk v. AMA based on an error in jury instructions.
I was able to appeal and get a reversal. It took us over a year to get that appeal to the 7th Circuit. Then they took an appeal to the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to reverse the 7th Circuit. They were unsuccessful. We finally get a decision of the Supreme Court sending it back to the trial court. We get back to the trial court and you don't get the same judge, nor did Judge Bua want it. We had to wait until there was an available judge that would take what to them seemed like a complex case, an antitrust case involving most of the medical societies, seeking an injunction that would apply to everything they do and not asking for damages.
I'm sure if George were going to go back, he would never have tried it the way he did the first time, because the first trial that we essentially filed, we lost. And the reason we lost is because the AMA used patient safety, all of the nonsense and advertisements and so forth that the chiropractic profession were essentially doing, which wasn't really the best in the world back in those days. The first trial was lost. And essentially, the judge in that first trial knew that there was adequate reasons to appeal. It was a question of, was there an economic boycott to destroy the profession? And an economic boycott is illegal. It's an illegal activity. And that's what happened in the second trial. George pulled a rabbit out of the hat by, number one, requesting a bench trial, and number two, no economic damages. AMA attorneys, frankly, didn't quite know how to approach this. There was a gentleman who was a professor of economics at Michigan State, who was a star witness, and Dr. Stano's analysis of the economics of chiropractic clearly demonstrated by overwhelming evidence that the AMA was guilty of an economic boycott. And of course, a new trial was ordered. The first trial had a jury, and the second trial was a bench trial. Now, wow, there is a phenomenal difference in a court of law when you have a trial with juror and you have a trial with nothing but a judge. The dynamics are incredibly different. Judge Getzendara had just been selected for the bench. Her background was kind of interesting. She has got a mind like a steel trap, and she was an absolutely brilliant attorney. It was astounding, the ability of her to recall what page things were on, almost verbatim. When she got on the bench, she was looking for some case, and she just happened to be going into Judge Bua's office and basically said, I'm looking for some cases. There are boxes full of stuff. The judge apparently found it interesting, so she took on the case and thought she was going to have an easy case.
We told Judge Getzendanner that we would like to have a bench trial. The bench trial would mean that there would be no jury, but the judge would decide what relief we were entitled to. What we were entitled to was an injunction that would be far-reaching and go to the basis of the antitrust wrongs. I told him, you're not going to get much in the way of damages when you've only got 4 chiropractors. I want an injunction that will apply to the entire medical world, or at least all of the defendants that are in this case. And that is the thing that was most important, because if we'd won the jury case back in 1980, we would have been stuck with trying to prove damages for all the chiropractors in the country, and we didn't have them as plaintiffs. She joked later that I made it tougher on her because she had to pay closer attention to everything. She didn't have to rely on 9 or 10 jurors to make decisions for her, but she had a brilliant mind. The AMA had concealed the documents from a prominent member of the board of the AMA who taught after he got out of the military. He noticed patients that had been to chiropractors was that females going through pregnancy, particularly during deliveries, when the pain in the back is heavy, that would be easily, or at least better, taken care of by chiropractic adjustments, saving the woman from unnecessary chemicalization. When you give a painkiller, you upset the normal body activities. And when you give an adjustment, you just move some of the articulations of the spine around to try to relieve the pressure. Obviously, a woman giving birth is having all sorts of stresses on her structure. When it was made known to her that the AMA had a document that said, don't let anyone know about this, the AMA hand must not show. They had 14 documents that said that. They were trying to conceal everything. They were trying to make certain that their local organizations made it clear that the MDs should not directly or indirectly deal with chiropractors. All of a sudden, the testimony came in, and she stood up and took the judge's hammer, slammed it down on the table, and said, I can't believe that. Is this serious? I'm a mother. I had those pains. And you concealed the fact that there was evidence known to a good doctor who's a trustee of the AMA, who had made the point that he had seen the benefit to pregnant women giving birth to have a chiropractic adjustment. The courtroom had about 150 spectators. They went out into the hallway and they filled up the ceremonial courtroom with mostly MDs. About 20 chiropractors were there, but well over 100 MDs came for the trial. In the entryway, they put rows of chairs, and then out into the hallway, they put rows of chairs, and they put megaphones out there so that the people that were there could hear but not see what was going on in the court. She then called, because of the frustrations of the court, because of her slamming the desk and all that, she says, time for a timeout. You got to go out and get this out of your system. I don't want you continuing to talk and buzz out there about what I just commented on. Pay attention to the substance of what I said, not the way I said it, because it made an impression on me, and I'm the finder of fact.
Remember H. Doyle Taylor? He's the former city editor of the Des Moines Register who was hired by the AMA to lead the Committee on Quackery. During the first trial, Mr. Taylor disappeared to Arizona in the dark of night. Now, George McAndrews needed him back for the second trial.
And remember now, this was 10 years after the first trial or thereabouts. They objected like all get out. They brought in an affidavit from his son that he was not qualified to engage in transit on the airplane or the train or anything. I said, well, then, Your Honor, can I have a professional check him out to see if he's able to travel? They really objected to that. She said, of course you can. I went to an osteopathic physician, somewhere in between medicine and chiropractic. He submitted his report to her in secret, and she came out in front of the whole court. She said, this fellow could walk to Chicago from Phoenix. He's so healthy. The osteopath had examined him and found out that he was playing golf 3 days a week, 18 holes, and that he was in very good health. I said I would like permission to go out to Arizona and take his deposition. So I was able to take, instead of 2 days of deposition, she told me I could have 8 hours.
That was another one of those kinds of things that she was angry about, because the profession that she chose, which was law, was supposedly the highest ethics and the highest accountability. And several of the things during the trial essentially destroyed that image.
It was interesting, the entire case, and she wrote an extensive opinion and gave us a great injunction. The difference for the world of chiropractic has been enormous. It hasn't been complete, because there's no question that chiropractors still compete with medical doctors. If you read the book, you'll see there's about 3 places where I said I wanted the lawsuit to get revenge. I was successful. I could probably have said, give me X number of dollars, and they probably would have written a check right there. But I wasn't interested in anything but an injunction and a publication of their activities. I'll just say God was on our side during the trial.
In 1987, Judge Susan Getzendanner ruled the AMA had engaged in a nationwide boycott of doctors of chiropractic. The AMA appealed the Getzendanner order to send her decision to all its members and to print it in the Journal of the American Medical Association. In 1988, JAMA published Judge Getzendanner's order, along with an editorial by AMA claiming partial victory. In 1990, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 7th Federal District affirmed Judge Getzendanner's decision. Also in 1990, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to review the case, thereby upholding the Getzendanner ruling. In 1992, the AMA and Wilk et al. Reached a settlement. The Getzendanner decision was published in the American Medical News. Funds were dispersed to 17 chiropractic colleges and lawyer fees. Finally, in 1992, the AMA sent copies of the decision to its members.
The last fall of the gavel with the U.S. Supreme Court. That was a 14-year journey. Not many lawyers would have found a way to make it happen. Along the way, they had offers to settle the case. George knew that if they accepted the money, the day afterwards, the AMA would declare victory, even though they paid to end the case. George was dedicated to winning. In a sense, his motive was revenge. He wanted to support his father, who was deceased, as we've indicated. He wanted to support his father's profession. And not too many lawyers would have fit the bill on this. He did everything he could to keep the bills down. He's a large man. He's like 6'4". He drove to a lot of the depositions. Rather than a hotel, he would sleep in the car. If you can imagine him curling up on the front seat of, I don't know what he had, an Oldsmobile, something like that. Back in his college days, he ended up going on the GI Bill. He went on the cheap wherever he could. He kept himself going with peanut butter sandwiches, and he did the same thing as a very grown-up lawyer. He had his name on the door at his law firm. His law firm didn't like the fact that he had accepted this because his law firm felt like the other ones. You know, we should be getting the big drug companies. We should be getting the medical associations. We don't want to be working with these chiropractors who we're not even sure they can pay the bills. I think the book is the first time maybe that George has publicly mentioned this. They did not pay him bonuses. Lawyers, like a lot of other professionals, are dependent on the bonus. He was raising a large family himself in the suburbs of Chicago. They didn't give him clerical support. He had some volunteers among friends and the staff at the law firm. He was punished by his colleagues in his firm. Know your history. It explains why you are where you are. The book has a chapter talking about some of the good things that happened to chiropractic as a result of the Wilk case. But not everything has been good. I told the story of a chiropractor who indeed got referrals from a major hospital in Chicago, their sports medicine practice. It's a major hospital. And she gets referrals from them, and she's out in the Chicago suburbs. But in her own community, the doctors at the emergency department and a couple of the family practitioners, MDs, tell their patients, I don't want to see you if you see a chiropractor. And they won't look at the films that she takes. And let me mention who her dad is. It's George McAndrews, the guy who fought all these battles. And now his own daughter is facing these battles. Many battles were won. Many changes have been made. Chiropractors are places that you never would have expected. They've had articles published in the Journal of the AMA where chiropractor used to be a dirty word. Christine Gertz, who's a well-known chiropractor. Dr. Ham, who serves on a very important AMA committee, and they call him doctor. And you should read the book and read his description of what happened. A lot of good things have happened. The day may come when chiropractic is more affiliated with medical schools. That hasn't happened yet, but it may happen in terms of learning basics such as anatomy. They're two different worlds, but they overlap to some degree. I can't predict the future, but there's somebody out there that's a young chiropractor who may read my book, may make a difference, just like Chester Wilk read that horrible book in the public interest. One person reading one book can change the world, and I believe that Chester Wilk did.
The biggest moment of this particular trial was when we won. We sent out literally tens of thousands of copies of the results of what happened in JAMA. We sent it out to every legislator in the United States, every judge, every neurologist, orthopod, whatever the case might be. Hundreds of thousands of these were sent out with a specific cover letter. If you do something and then nobody knows about it, what good is it? We wanted to make sure that everybody knew about it. I will take my hat off to the ACA at the time because it really supported. Matter of fact, there were two issues of significance that the ACA was really behind. One of them was the distribution of this enormous task of sending out the actual court decision. And then the second one was the same group that received the AHCPR, the guidelines from the Agency for Healthcare Policy and Finance. That was in 1994. That was so significant that a healthcare agency recognized chiropractic and manipulation. We wanted to make sure that not just a few of the academics knew that. We basically distribute that by the tens of thousands. And so those kinds of little shifts, of course, some of the other highlights, that one of the things that I was so proud of my profession in 1985, at the end of the oil embargo, I remember getting a copy of Reader's Digest, and it was an 8-page insert from Shell Oil telling people how to save fuel. I thought, gee, that's kind of a neat idea. We ought to do that for chiropractic. I contacted Reader's Digest, and that little 8-page insert cost $1 million back in 1985. I told them I was going to raise funds from my colleagues. They kind of dismissed me and couldn't wait to get me out the door, I think. Well, as fate would have it, we basically had been doing some preliminary image analysis of what the general public thought of chiropractic back in the 80s. We did 2 inserts into Reader's Digest, each of them costing $1 million. We had 5,000 chiropractors contributed $200 for an 8-page insert in Reader's Digest, in keeping with the recognition of what the general public thought chiropractors were. Howard Walensky, the guy who wrote the book, actually, and interesting character, worked for the AMA News. I got the AMA News as a subscriber, which was really kind of weird. I had a couple MD friends who basically gave me their AMA News. Howard was on AMA News staff, and then apparently had some issues with some of the ethics and integrity of the folks, and basically left and went over to the Chicago Sun-Times. We did not get much fair treatment by the press. I mean, we got a couple of headlines, and when we lost, of course, it was devastating. And when we won, we had a few pieces here. Howard decided to write a book called The Serpent on the Staff. Well, if you read Howard's book, he has a chapter in there on the Wilkes suit, but he has also a chapter on all kinds of other things that in healthcare were not necessarily in the best of light. Howard essentially was an investigative reporter and revealed the secrets that they wanted to keep under wraps. A couple of years ago, in conversation with George, I mentioned Howard, and George said, I think Howard is retired. Let me see if I can still get a hold of him. George made a call and said, you know, I have a friend of mine who's thinking about getting a book written. Would you be interested? Howard said yes. He got the two of us together, and from there, the rest is history.
I ended up doing a book with Tom Brune called The Serpent on the Staff, the AMA's logo. The subtitle was The Unhealthy Politics of the AMA. We were maybe too nice to them because we didn't get into any of these financial scandals. We looked instead at the policy issues. There was a chapter about chiropractic and how the AMA tried to destroy chiropractic and other alternative approaches to medicine. And that's where I got noticed in the chiropractic world.
Chiropractic finally won the Wilk v. AMA case, and Judge Getzendanner issued the long-sought injunction. It took 14 years. In Mr. Walensky's book, Contain and Eliminate, there's an afterword that discusses the impact the case had on the chiropractic profession. I've read it, and the impact is profound. So that battle was hard fought and ultimately won. But what impact has Wilk v. AMA had, and what lies ahead? Certainly for the chiropractic profession, the battles aren't over. Dr. Lou Sportelli shares his thoughts.
That's the kind of enthusiasm, that's the kind of passion, that's the kind of energy that the profession had. And I hope we don't lose that. Recently, I've had the opportunity to speak with some of the student leaders and there seems to be a resurgence of passion. I'm hoping that this new decade of new leaders that I'm sensing a sense of passion and a sense of responsibility and obligation to take the profession and move it forward. That's what's needed. We need a resurgence of enthusiasm and passion for who we are. We suffered as a profession from the pathology of exclusion for lots and lots and lots of decades. The young practitioners today are going to be thinking, okay, what is my future? Our young practitioners will be in a very different model than we were in. No better, no worse, just different. In the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. We fought with litigation, no question. Chiropractors were very litigious. They sued everybody and everything. And that was sort of a nice image to have because people tended to be concerned about whether the chiropractors were going to sue them. After the Wilk suit, I want to tell you something. The threat of litigation by the chiropractors became very real. So that was one way we fought. Then we fought with legislation because the only way to change the law is through the legislature. Weren't licensed in all the states, so we had to legislate to get licensed. They weren't reimbursed in all the states, so we had to legislate to get reimbursement. So pretty much of that is pretty passé now. The only weapon that is meaningful, in my view, is the weapon called research. There's never going to be enough research. Every one of these research projects ends with the phrase, more research is needed. I haven't seen the same kind of enthusiasm, passion, dedication, and commitment to supporting research as there was to support individual state legislation or individual state legal action. I'm hoping with that kind of a mindset where we understand research is the only weapon that will open up the doors that had been closed, is we need research to validate and support and substantiate what it is that we say we do. We've always had to take money out of our own pockets to pay for litigation, to pay for legislation, to support all the things that we're doing. I would suggest that research become the mantra, because that's where we're going to go. That's what's going to open the doors in all of the future endeavors that we talked about, whether it's integration, hospitals, research, VA, whatever. Research is going to open those doors much more rapidly than anything else we could do. As the NCMIC Foundation president, my first goal was to achieve $25 million in our research foundation core. Why? Because $25 million will spin off $1 million of investment income on an annual basis, not coming out of the pockets of the chiropractors, but coming out of the investment income. If you're going to rally around anything, rally around research and continue to support the NCMIC Foundation. I want this book to be a fair, impartial, objective story about the trial, but I want it to be interesting. And I remember my quote to him is that I don't want a dry book. I want something to read like The Search for Red October. And he laughed and he said, I'll see what I can do. And I think Howard accomplished a really, really good book with some intrigue, some mystery, some information, some outcomes, and I think he did a great book.
That wraps up today's webinar, episode 2 of the Contain and Eliminate story. I'd like to thank Howard Walensky, George McAndrews, and Dr. Lou Sportelli for taking time with us to share this piece of chiropractic history. Please join us next Tuesday, January 12th, for a live question and answer session with our 3 panelists. A reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available at ncmic.com. All registered attendees will automatically receive the recording via email. Before we go, I'd like to remind you of our resources section on ncmic.com. We're continually adding to our content with information to help you navigate daily practice and deal with challenges that you face. We have information out there on a wide variety of topics, including COVID issues and risk management, so please check that out. You can also keep up to date on new resources from NCMIC by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'd also like to remind you of our new podcast, Chiropractical. We have a new episode out and available. Remember, you can download episodes of Chiropractical at ncmic.com or wherever you get your podcast. Once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. We're looking forward to our Q&A webinar coming next Tuesday, and I hope you'll be able to join us.